In a world full of darkness, it's time to let the light shine bright. This is Strength to Overcome, where faith and action help us grow through adversity.
G'day, everybody. Welcome back to the Strength to Overcome podcast. I am Matt Morton, your host, and I'm extremely blessed to be back with you for another episode today. This is going to be a good one. This has impact for everybody, whether you are in the church, not in the church, religious, diving in on things, or a skeptic, an atheist. It doesn't really matter. This concept affects absolutely everybody, whether you want it to or not, because it's all around us. And I wanted to dive in today on a topic that means a lot to me, and I'm going to unpack it a little bit. So if you stay with me long enough, you'll hopefully walk away with some nuggets and some questions of your own. But I have titled today's episode, What If the Bible is a Fraud? And I'm going to hold up a classic old King James version there and the scriptures here, but we've got these Bibles here. And, for a lot of people that hear that title, What If the Bible is a Fraud? It's an absolutely terrifying and dangerous question. And I don't mean, what if we've interpreted a few verses incorrectly? I'm actually saying, what if we got doctrine wrong? What if my church was wrong, or your church was wrong, or the denominations that we've become part of are wrong? Today, I'm asking something even bigger than that. What if the whole thing is a fraud? What if the reality that we've been handed, well, what if it's not the reality that we're actually living in? What if there's more going on around us that most of us have actually been even willing to consider? Now, these aren't questions that I came up with just yesterday for today's topic. I have actually genuinely wrestled with them. But to understand how I got there, I want to go back just a little bit to help the audience understand, because from about 2006 to 2016, let's just call it that 10-year window, I went on what I can only describe as an unquenchable thirst for truth. I was memorizing hundreds of verses of Bible passages, huge chapters at a time. In fact, I actually memorized the entire book of James word for word. And I was studying ancient manuscripts. I was looking at church history. I was looking into the science side of things, the archaeology, the biblical calendar. Now, anything that challenged scripture caught my attention. Now, I didn't want to necessarily encourage controversy in my search, but I was genuinely interested because I actually wanted to know what was true and what I'd been handed and what I could live according to, because it has to be able to be tested for me to stand behind it. And so the search became intense. Now, it wasn't something I was just doing every now and then or on the weekends. It wasn't something I was just doing for a Bible study. It was actually something that I was doing on a daily basis, morning and night. It was part of what I was living and breathing. And I was dialing in on the scriptures that I was memorizing. I was filling notebooks, just one after the other, hundreds of pages of notes and highlighted portions. And these questions eventually led me to the opportunity to go to Israel, because I wanted to actually stand where a lot of these biblical narratives actually took place. Now, I didn't think going there was going to answer every question, but I thought it might help me understand some of what I'd been reading and memorizing. And so I wanted to walk the land. I wanted to see the geography, rub shoulders with the people there, and talk to others that were also searching. So I went with a big group, and it was an amazing trip. It was an incredible trip that I've now got lifelong friends from. But it wasn't just a theoretical search for me. I was willing to actually go and travel and spend the money and the time to pull this off. And that was back in 2015. And fast forward a year later, I'm selling my gem. My wife and I, with a marriage hanging on by a thread, sold everything, sold the house, sold all our belongings, packed a ton of stuff into a couple of suitcases, and moved to Mexico really probably trying to save our marriage. And in the long run, I'll pause there. In the long run, I ended up digging in even more while I was in Mexico because for those 6 months, there was a particular question that just grabbed me and I ran with it. And it was the biblical calendar. I was filling up those notebooks again. I was building charts. I was comparing feast days. I was studying astronomy. I had those apps where I was looking at things from where I was in Mexico and comparing it with people that were back in the States and in Australia. I'd have people come down. I had some friends that came down and we did some study together and we were pouring through the scriptures and challenging each other. It was a pretty wild time where I was really diving in. And we were trying to reconcile the calendar, which we'll dive in a little bit more on here shortly. But also during those 6 months, I completed my pastoral training, which was a 2-year course, and I did that in 6 months as well. So I was packing a lot into this 6 months. And towards the end of my time there, I actually began a 40-day water only fast. Now, a lot of that is in episode 2 of this podcast. So go back and unpack that a little bit, but because I don't want to get stuck retelling that story today. But eventually, I was actually midway through the fast when this happened, but eventually we left Mexico, but we didn't leave together. And I found myself living in Northern California and looking after a property for some people I'd been in touch with. And it was an isolated time, but I kept searching. I kept digging. In fact, I went even harder and I started a website called rabbitholeministries.com. It became the place where I was organizing all of this decade worth information into one place. And not long after that, I ended up going to Egypt. And I was there during the vernal equinox intentionally because I was looking for answers. So I was standing at the pyramids, I was at the Sphinx. I'm trying to understand this biblical calendar, and so I was willing to spend money on it, travel for it. Again, I'm building charts again and more notebooks, right? I'm going through the same process on this. And so I'm walking the lands now that are found in scripture. And I believe that there had to be a purpose behind everything I'd spent all these years studying for. And I was diving in on all this, and then the divorce papers arrived. And something in me at that moment changed. The lights didn't go all out at once, but they were starting to get dimmer. I was still in Northern California at the time, and I was still around some like-minded believers and in touch with them on a regular basis. And so I still studied, I was still searching, but it wasn't like before. The depth wasn't there, it was gone, and the hunger was now different. Because there was something inside of me that I couldn't reconcile something. If I'd spent all those years digging in and diving, memorizing scriptures, going to feasts, rubbing shoulders with people, traveling to these lands, spending a lot of time and money diving in, I was fasting, I was praying, I was trying to understand Yahweh and truth, and my marriage still couldn't be saved. So I started to think, well, maybe I've missed something, right? Maybe I was wrong. Maybe the thing that I had built so much of my entire life around wasn't what I thought it was. And so I didn't stop searching immediately. For the next couple of years, I still had people around me that we were able to dive in on these things together. People I could talk to, people I could study with, people who kept that search alive within me, but the intensity was gone. I didn't have the memorization charts out. I didn't have the notebooks. I didn't have the highlighter. The website started to just slowly fade away. The content that I was putting up just sat there. And so the growth of that slowly faded out. And the search that had once consumed pretty much every part of my life was now really barely something I was recognizing myself with. So in 2018, I'll fast forward because a lot of this is past story of episodes, but I remarried and life started to, move forward, right? You're going on with things. And the questions hadn't gone away. They were just not something I gave time to. So again, fast forward to February 2020, we left California, quit our jobs, moved to Florida. And that's when my search really did start to take a different turn. Because for the first time, I wasn't asking whether the misunderstood parts of the Bible, misunderstood parts of the Bible needed more digging. I actually started asking whether the Bible itself could be part of the greater deception. And so I went down some what people might consider pretty dark rabbit holes. The kind of questions that probably most of the time over the last 1,000 years would have me burned to the stake, or, I'm definitely a heretic. Because I started to ask these questions. What if we're living in some kind of a simulation? And I think a lot of people have thought those things over the years, but they don't really want to give it too much weight. They don't want to get caught down that, right? That vacuum. But what if the reality that we experience isn't actually the ultimate reality? The movies like The Matrix, Truman Show, a classic, Jim Carrey, Avatar. If anyone hasn't seen that, you'll understand what I'm talking about. With the concept of you've got this vessel, right? We've got the island, which also talks about it, right? We've got these examples that in Hollywood, I think sometimes they're putting stuff out in front of us, and so we've got to be thoughtful on researching it because you can't believe everything you see, but it certainly does give your brain something to think about. And there's so many other things out there, so many TV shows and concepts out there. But what if we're being shown that we're living in these bodies and we're still connected to something beyond what we can see? What if there's another layer to the reality, right? Or another explanation for our consciousness? Or even why we're here, right? The purpose. You watch The Island and you'll understand that. No spoiler alerts here. But then the question started to become even more uncomfortable, right? What if there's powerful people, governments, institutions, complete empires, right, that over time have manipulated information throughout history? And is it possible that religion had been fabricated or manipulated as well? Could scripture have been created to control the masses? Is a question I had to wrestle with. Maybe it was used to create fear of punishment, to tell people how to live, tell people how to spend their time, spend their money, their loyalty, right? We see people go to war over religion. In fact, I think statistically it's the reason why we have the most deaths in history is over religion, over your belief system, right? Not over taking land, but your belief system has now become responsible for the most deaths and wars in history. So could these manuscripts have been fabricated to create this environment that we live in? Can ancient discoveries have been completely manipulated? For instance, Dead Sea Scrolls. I don't know if you're familiar with those, but that's something that was found. And could they just be part of a story that we've been simply told to believe and accept that these things just happen to be found at the right time, right? So, and I know how that can sound because I think at times people probably did that to me before I was in this place. And, you kind of put the hands up. You're like, whoa, where is this coming from? What's going on with your walk, right? Why are you not sticking to the scriptures and sitting in the pew every week, just following along? But I couldn't get past, right? So I started to realize that there are tens upon tens of thousands of different Christian denominations out there. They're all reading the same Bible, and they're all coming to radically different conclusions. And so you got one group saying this, you got one group saying that. Like I said, you got countries and people going to war over their belief systems, and one group saying this is holy, another group saying it doesn't really matter, it's irrelevant, that was then, now we've got a different, New Testament, we've got all this stuff, right? And so some people are claiming we got this content that's required for salvation. Other people say, well, no, that leads you away from salvation. And so I got to the point where I thought, well, hang on a minute, if there's 40,000 different denominations and they all claim that they've got the truth, why can't I investigate 40,001? Why can't I dig in on the possibility that maybe everybody's missed something? I'm not saying I'm trying to come up with the perfect solution, but why not, right? No one's stopping me. I'm allowed to do that. In fact, I'm encouraged through scripture to do that. Or even if you don't have any biblical background or knowledge at all, test what you're being raised in. And so for several years, I was diving in on this, but I wasn't really reading the scripture anymore. I was more searching the world around me. I was searching reality, consciousness, history, the ancient civilizations, control systems, simulation theories, and the nature of existence itself. I wasn't necessarily trying to disprove the Bible. I was trying to figure out whether there was enough explanation for all of this to fit in together, right? Something bigger, something hidden, something that perhaps I hadn't considered before. It was exciting. And so during those years, I was diving in, but my family was growing. We had two beautiful daughters in 2019, into 2019, and then again in 2021. And so life became busy. And as my girls grew, I started to have another question just silently plugging away at me. What am I going to teach them? Because it's one thing to spend your own existence, your own life questioning everything, but it's another thing entirely when you got two little girls looking up at you and you're responsible for helping them understand the world around you or around them. And what am I meant to tell them? All right. Do I teach them scripture? Do I teach them things that I'd spent, a decade earlier memorizing and going through, things that I was raised with, as a kid in my denomination? Do I just tell them I don't know? Do I wait until I've got every answer, right? And for a long time, I actually did that. I was paralyzed, right? Analysis paralysis. And so I just waited. And then obviously this last 18 months, last March, where I had that bicep tear and had the surgery, right? So I'm in this brace and I'm in the attic and I'm looking for something else. And I see this box that I think what I'm looking for might be in. And I open it up and there were my Bibles, right? My notebooks, years and years, books, just piles of notepads and books and content, markings in the columns, highlighted, torn pages, the whole thing, right? I've got questions, I got connections, I got research, and I actually found a manuscript that I had paid over $1,000 for years earlier. And I look at it and it's been eaten by rats. And it's frayed and the pages are ripped. And I just stood there in the attic with this headlamp staring at this box of materials that some of them dated back to when I was a kid, like 5, 6 years old in school. And then these ancient things that I've got, things that I collected from Israel. And I'm like, man, when did this happen? Now, I'm not talking about the manuscript. I'm talking about me. Because somewhere along the way, in a world where everything became digital and every question can be typed into a search engine, a phone, a tablet, a computer, or it's got a video attached to it, right? I'd lost the connection to the physical evidence that I had collected over the years from around the world. And so I had this overwhelming sensation. I'm like, man, I've been brought up here with my arm, and I shouldn't have even been up there. Because if I'd have fallen or twisted it, it would have, ripped it open again, and that would have been horrific. I got one lucky surgery as it was, where they could reattach it. And so I shouldn't have even been up there. And I'm diving around in this stuff and had this thought that maybe my question wasn't really the Bible or even everything that I'd investigated outside of it. But maybe I needed to put them together, right? Maybe I needed to compare them side by side, what I'd been diving in on and what I'd almost not left behind, but stopped searching for so diligently. So what if I didn't actually have to choose between the two and let go of one to hold on to another? Maybe the ancient stories, the physical evidence, the mythology, the questions about creation. What if they all actually connected the scriptures in a way I hadn't considered before? Now, I didn't grab the answer that day, but it was something that did get me going again. It was slowly, and then, a rolling stone gathers no moss, right? I started to pick up a little bit of momentum. And so it's only really been over these last handful of months since I took over the podcast as a solo host, something really started to change because I started having to open the scripture again. If I wanted to be my authentic self and put these episodes out there, I started to realize I had to dive in on some things that I used to have memorized verbatim and start diving in on these things, but I had not yet connected the dark ages, let's call it, of my journey with the previous age of search. And because I was now speaking authentically, I was forced to dive in on, again, well, what do I really believe? Not what has the church told me to repeat, but what am I going to do moving forward? And so, ironically, the rabbit holes that I had previously thought were pulling me away from scripture actually started to pull me back in. And they started to become things that I wanted to talk about and share. And so I started laying out everything together on the table as a blank canvas to see, right, what can I put on here that's going to gel? How is this puzzle going to come together now, right? I don't want to just have one or the other, but could I put the two together, right? And so I looked at the creation, I looked at the structure of the world that we're living in, the giants, the Nephilim, the flood. We've talked about some of these things, the ancient writings and mythology that's been preserved across civilizations in the biblical calendar that I still haven't been able to resolve. But I decided today to talk a little bit about 5 particular topics to see if there's a pattern there that I can connect these two together with and help people answer the very question of the episode. What if the Bible's a fraud? And so these 5 topics for me had to start with the flat earth, which I've done an episode on, right? So stay with me here because I know a lot of people are going to roll their eyes. They're going to dive out now and say, all right, here he goes. But stay with me because I didn't become a flat earth podcast for a reason. I wanted a body of evidence that wasn't just, hey, this guy's got a tinfoil hat on and thinks it's flat. It's, let's look at what the world around us is saying for these areas and see if maybe there's a common theme happening here that people want to instantly dismiss because we've been taught to not think critically. It all comes together, I think, in my opinion, if you're willing to stop, put everything on the table, like I said, and start fresh. So flat earth wasn't actually something I went looking for. I didn't just decide to chase all these rabbit holes. It was something that was actually brought to me. And I wasn't actually looking for this conspiracy, as people call it. It was brought to me by a friend. And when it was brought to me, I thought, man, this is something that I need to ask myself. What do I actually believe? Because we've got this concept of what the world's telling us. And then there's something different in the scriptures. Right? There's a disconnect. And that's a massive conflict. Because now it's a foundational issue. A lot of people say, well, how does it matter? What does it mean to me? It's like, well, if you're going to church, you're reading the Bible and you're living a life, you've got 2 different narratives because as you start reading through scripture, it's not just one or two verses that you can pull out. You'll start to find there's hundreds of verses upon the scriptures and other texts that talk about, in some way, we've got the heavens, the earth, the sun, the moon, the waters, right? The structure of everything that you see, and it doesn't match what they're telling us. So it's not a bunch of isolated verses, it's a collection of a concept here. And so I became convinced that, to me, the narrative was consistently describing a world that conflicted with the world we've been told exists. Because in Genesis, it describes a firmament separating the waters above from the waters below. We've got the sun, the moon, the stars are placed inside the firmament. And even in Joshua, it's talking about this situation where he's asking the sun and the moon to stand still. He's not asking for the earth to stop rotating, right? He says the sun and the moon to stop, right? So even in that story, it's not just an isolated verse where you say, well, it's, back then. It's like, well, no, he knew, right? It's not just one or two verses, like I said, right? We've got the flood account where it talks about the windows of heaven opening up and flooding, right? And so if it's waters above, waters below, then that explains the flooding. And we've got great fountains bursting forth from below, right? So again, the scriptures are compiling a body of evidence, and throughout scripture, Yahweh is described as being above, looking down upon the earth. And this happens over and over again. And I used to wrestle with, well, how does he do that on this spinning thing that's going through, right? It's rotating and all this is happening. It's like, how is he above us looking down? Like, how is he looking around? Is he looking sideways? Like, it doesn't make any sense. But you start to read through these scriptures as a body of evidence, and then you think back to what you were taught at school, what you see on television, the science books, the documentaries, the movies, and everywhere you look, you're getting a different model. And so that conflict just became more and more impossible for me to ignore. And I encourage a lot of other people to do the same search, right? Because then I thought, well, hang on, maybe my understanding of the scriptures was wrong, or maybe the model that I've accepted, right? It's wrong. Well, okay, something's off. And so what I couldn't do anymore was pretend that there wasn't this major contradiction and I could just accept it and get on with it. That was, to me, the turning point. And I realized that most Christians, including myself, for most of my life, have found a way to believe two completely different descriptions of the world without actually stopping to ask whether they can both actually coexist and be true. And to me, that wasn't acceptable. I had to investigate it, so I read, I compared, I challenged all the assumptions. I went through those scriptures that I was just talking about, and again and again and again. I didn't go looking for the flat earth, right? It came to me. But once I had done the search and I dived in on the conflict and started reading for myself, that concept changed the way I would now read scripture forever, right? It wasn't just this flat earth, but this was the kickstart back then, way back when, that taught me to think critically, even of the scriptures, against what the model is that I'm getting told today. And so that brings me to the second point, right? We're not going to dive in any further on it. This is a search that you yourself need to do, right? But again, I'm not trying to become a flat earth channel, because it's an overwhelming series of things that I think when you step outside and look with your own eyes and think critically, you start to see a pattern here. And so for me, the second point that I want to make today is about the giants and the Nephilim. Now, people have heard the concept giants, maybe not Nephilim, right? But we all grow up, even outside of religious circles, knowing the story of David and Goliath, right? We've got the shepherd, we've got the giant, we've got the sling, we've got a stone, bam, hits him in the head, kills him, cuts his head off, becomes the king of Israel, right? And a lot of people have that as, okay, that's historical, right? We've got no question there. And We run with it. But then I started reading the Bible differently because of other things. Again, this is all way back when that I'm revisiting, but these are the key points I want to bring to you today. Because I then had to realize, well, okay, hang on a minute. Goliath wasn't the beginning of the story of the giants, right? It's actually more towards the end of one, right? Where you don't see a lot of it after that. Because in Genesis 6, that's where it introduces the Nephilim. And the scripture then talks about the Anakim, the Rephaim, and Og, the king of Bashan, which I've talked about in a Giants episode. And we've got these descendants living in Canaan when Israel was entering the promised land. And I've talked about that too. So now I've got this sudden realization that the Bible's not mentioning giants once or twice, right? This is a historical narrative that continues a pattern. It's a thread. It's not just this David and Goliath and then get on with it. He wasn't just a super tall guy with a ton of muscles, creating issues. This is a theme throughout Scripture. And so what you'll find is that the biblical writers or whoever's recording these events, they're describing these giants, these Nephilim, as historical people. They're not coming up with fables, right? There's too many instances of it for this to just be, stories that have been passed on from generation to generation. These are considered historical, right? At least to the writers at the time, right? So then you got to think, well, okay, have I been taught this David and Goliath story, but the rest is mythology? And that generally happens a lot in Christianity, right? So I started digging in. You've got Genesis, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Samuel. You've got the prophets, right? This is all through Scripture. Then you start looking at ancient civilizations. You look at the ancient traditions, you look at historical writings and architecture all around the world, which is just mind-blowing. If you ever get a chance, just type something in of that nature and just see what pops up. It's going to blow your mind. Again, you can't believe everything you see, but it's pretty obvious when you start to see massive stone structures or these facilities or temples or things carved into mountains. You see these giant doorways that are absolutely enormous, and ceiling heights of these things where they've gone in later on and they've cut in a regular 8-foot doorway into these other giant doorways that you never even consider. Why would these other doorways be 50 feet tall or even more? And on hinges too. It's like these were doors. These weren't just, okay, we're going to bring in elephants. Like, these were giant doors, and these things are all around the world today. You can dive in on that, right? You're going to see giant staircases. You see these areas where you got these pyramids, and these steps are absolutely enormous. And you see these pictures of these little humans that almost have to climb up, or they've built this stairway next to these structures, And to me, it's just fascinating that we overlook there's this tiny little stairway that's been built to these other giant stairways, right? And we've got construction all around that archaeologists are still arguing about today. How they were done. How could people our size have possibly made them, and why were they so big in the first place? So I'm not suggesting that everything that's oversized proves giants existed, but you start to see a body of evidence around, right? Because today's topic is, what if the Bible's a fraud, right? So we're starting to compile things that you can see with your own eyes. And so I started to see these things over and over and over, and I was walking and seeing some of these things in person that start to influence my overall leaning of something, right? Again, this is all part of history. A lot of this you can go and see now. Get on a plane, go travel these places, and you'll stand there and go, okay, this is definitely not being built by a 6-foot man hundreds of years ago with horse and buggy, right? Or even thousands of years before with, hammer and chisel, right? Like caveman style. It's just a narrative that doesn't seem to make any sense. And so all of this became part of a larger piece of the puzzle for me, because now I started to look through Scripture through those lenses, right? And now you've got passages that start to make more sense, right? Because I took the Scriptures and I stopped trying to force it into modern assumptions or narratives or history. I allowed the Scriptures to tell their own story. And so the deeper I dug, the more I realized that the biblical authors were recording giants as historical people, right? And there's evidence all around the world that supports it. And it deserved my attention. So without getting stuck down there, let's get on to point 3, and that is the flood. Now, this is another one of those subjects where you got to ask yourself, is the scriptures preserving actual history, or is it another myth? Is it another story, right? Because Noah's flood isn't a small event, right? It's something that affects everyone and everything around the world, right? Humanity is not divided by it, but you're affected by it. Because you've got one world before the flood, and then you've got another world after it. And so if I'm going to take Genesis seriously, again, all right, a lot of this comes from Genesis, then I need to know whether there's something outside of the Bible that supports the possibility that something catastrophic actually took place. And so to me, that's where the investigation becomes fascinating, because the story of a massive flood isn't unique just to Genesis, right? It is in cultures all over the world, which we've talked about these other things being all around us, not just in the Bible. Now, for centuries, these things have been maintained, even though there's been a separation, right, by continents, languages, miles apart, things like this, right? But these ancient traditions of a catastrophic flood have been, maintained, right? We've got the Epic of Gilgamesh. We've got ancient Mesopotamian accounts. We've got flood traditions out of Asia. We've got things in Europe. We've got the Americas, right? And I'm not pretending that all of the accounts are identical, because they're not. The details are different. The names are different. And the cultures are all telling them, with a slight nuance, something slightly different. But you can't ignore the fact that civilizations across the world have preserved memories of a devastating flood. As I say that, I hear the thunder rumble in the background, right? The Almighty's got a sense of humor. But it did make me ask that simple question, right? Why is humanity recording these memories across all these civilizations and all these cultures of the same event? And so it took me beyond the ancient stories, right? I'm like, okay, now what do I see with my own eyes again? What do I need to do? Because then you start to look into this and you start to find these marine fossils, right, found high above today's sea level. Like we're talking mountains, we're talking elevations that have absolutely no way that there was a natural rising of sea levels to that height unless there's some sort of, major flooding or something of that nature. You've got massive sedimentary layers at that level. You've got fossil graveyards. I mean, you've got a collection of these things way above sea level, right? You got landscapes showing evidence of enormous erosion and deposition by water. And then I started looking at places that today seem absolutely almost impossible to associate with large amounts of water. You've got the Sahara Desert. Now think about that for a second, right? We've been taught that there's just this sand, it's always been, it'll always be that way. But there's evidence of these ancient lake beds and water collection, buried river systems, places that are completely bone dry today, including the Sahara and other places that carry evidence of major watery past. I remember being in Egypt and I saw this picture in a window where there was water all around the pyramids. And I'm actually looking behind me at the pyramids. I'm like, there's no water here or evidence there, but there's this picture of it. It wasn't a drawing, it was an actual picture of water there. I'm like, okay, wait, this doesn't make any sense. You're right. You've got to start thinking outside of what you've been told. That there was ancient waterways, not that long ago, where we've got pictures of this water system near the pyramids that's not there now. And that's just within this very small time of being able to have pictures to now. So think about over the course of hundreds, if not thousands of years, right? If that's where we've been, much more could have taken place. That there's still evidence in some places, but in others, another huge rolling thunder from above. So all of this was fascinating me because the world that you see today isn't necessarily the world that existed, right? So landscapes have changed, waterways have disappeared, the lakes have dried up, rivers have changed course, right? It's almost like there was water here and then it was gone. And the physical world is preserving evidence of all that. Now, does it prove the flood? Does it prove Genesis? Does it prove the Bible? No, right? Doesn't prove it because I wasn't there, I couldn't see it. But I don't have to pretend that it does because I'm not a geologist and I'm not an archaeologist. And I'm not trying to tell you that every fossil bed points to it, right? Every sedimentary layer or geological formation on Earth is pointing to it. And that's not what I'm asking you to make the jump to either, right? Because not everything is going to point to it. But there is a physical world that's showing enormous hydrological change in a catastrophic movement of water that has dramatically changed a lot of landscapes that we see today, and there's evidence of it. And so again, now I've got two things in front of me, right? I've got cultures around the world preserving memories of catastrophic floods. I've got the biblical account. And for me, that's enough to say, you know what? There's some major legitimacy to this, right? So I'm not trying to use Genesis to prove Genesis. I'm looking outside of that to the ancient cultures, the world around me, and ask if that evidence is enough. And for me, it was. Now, moving on to another point, right? Today's a long episode, but stay with me for those that are diving in. For those that really want to have a little bit more meat on the bone, that's what today is all about. So stay with me here because now I want to get into another point. And this is about the books that we've left behind, right? Because we've got these other books, and I've talked about this in the past, but we've got things like the Book of Enoch. And we could ask, why is that not in the Bible, right? Because once I started studying ancient writings like Enoch, Jasher, Jubilees, and other books that were in the Apocrypha, other books that were originally in the Bible, I started to have to realize, okay, well, some of these things are actually pointing towards Scripture, right? They actually provide context of the 66 books that we've got left. And without these other books that I've read and other people want to read, it starts to point towards Scripture making a little bit more sense, right? So let me make sure that you don't think, okay, I'm reading all this other stuff, that I've just found out there, right? These are writings that have been preserved across centuries in a lot of different religions. And there's a lot of different Christian cultures and traditions and communities that have broader biblical canons than what we've got today. So it's not just me saying, check out this book, it helps you understand the Bible, some guy's commentary, right? These are still preserved and read as Scripture in a lot of other places and communities and churches. And so for me, it became this very interesting concept of, well, what if I put these other writings, right? I'll say other, right? These other scriptural writings that are not in our current version of the Bible in, at least America, Australia, right? What if I put them next to the scriptures? Do they contradict them, right? Do they add context? Do they help explain everything, anything, right? And one of the first things that I came across was the book of Jude, because in Jude, it says, "And the angels which kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation, he's reserved in everlasting chains under darkness, unto the judgment of the great day." And then later in the same chapter, Jude says, "And Enoch, also the seventh from Adam, prophesied about these, saying, Behold, The Lord comes with 10,000s of his saints to execute judgment upon all. And that is very similar to the content that you're going to find in the book of Enoch. Now, that doesn't automatically prove that every surviving, manuscript of Enoch, or the version that we have today, is authentic, right? But to me, it's an important distinction, because it's enough for me to say, right, I'm going to investigate this. Because you've got Genesis 6 giving you this incredibly strange story, which we've talked about, but today's episode is an isolated episode, where we've got the sons of Yahweh, right? The sons of God, saw the daughters of man, and they took wives, and the Nephilim were in the earth in those days, right? Then, a few verses later, the earth is described as being corrupt and filled with violence, and then, of course, we've got the flood, right, to wipe them all out. So growing up, you heard these explanation that the sons of God, Yahweh, was simply the godly line of Seth, right? This is the Christian explanation that most people accept. Maybe it's comfortable, right? But they're marrying women from the line of Cain. But when you start reading the book of Enoch, right, that's quoted in Jude, you've got to accept there's a completely different framework happening here, right? Because now Enoch is describing these heavenly beings, right, that are watchers leaving their proper place. They're coming down, they're taking women, and they're producing offspring. Now, it describes them passing along forbidden knowledge that they passed on to humanity, right, and corruptions spreading across the earth, right? It describes violence, bloodshed, judgment. It's absolute chaos. And so now I'm looking at it going, wait, Genesis 6 isn't this isolated collection of this random few verses anymore. It's actually becoming part of a larger story. And to me, that story made me look differently at what came after the flood. We've got, again, the Nephilim, the Rephaim, the Anakim, and then the giants that we've talked a little bit about already earlier that Israel is encountering. And then you've got the commands of Yahweh to go in and destroy nations completely. Men, women, children, knock out the whole set. You don't even leave the animals alive, right? Because one of the accusations that people make against the Old Testament is that we've got this angry Yahweh. We've got this angry God of the Old Testament. He's violent, he's cruel, he's merciless, like slaughter them all. It's like, how could you kill men, women, and children, right? And people wrestle with that. Why is there this constant battle over these bloodlines? Why are there these repeated conflicts with these same people over and over again, right? Why are the giants and these specific tribes repeatedly identified and targeted? And then you read Enoch and the ancient traditions out of some of these other books, and now it's like, okay, now I've got this lens that helps me understand, or at least investigate, some of these passages differently. Because what if the story is not simply about Yahweh completely destroying these random innocent people, men, women, and children? What if there's a much larger conflict that's running through the entire biblical narrative, right? It's a conflict that involves rebellion, corruption, and specific bloodlines, and the preservation of that line through which the Messiah needs to come safely through. So again, I'm not telling you that I've proved every part of this theory, right? I'm simply pointing that it's worthy of your investigation when you start to consider some of these other things that might unlock the scriptures. Because everywhere you look in the ancient world, you're going to find stories of God's coming down, right? You're not going to hear this from your church pastor very often. And if you do, then that's fantastic. Let me know where they are. But you've got these constant stories of these gods, right, interacting with humans, and they're producing extraordinary offspring. We've got demigods, titans, heroes of enormous strength, and we've got these wars between these gods, right? We've got these civil wars, rebellions in the heavens, right? We've got these divine beings fighting one another. In Greek mythology, it's everywhere. Roman mythology, the Norse traditions. You watch those, shows like Vikings and stuff. It's all right there. They think they are the descendants of the gods, And they talk about it as if they literally believe that their father, right, or fathers were these heavenly gods. And Valhalla, right? And you die in war and you die honorably, you go there and you dine with them. They genuinely believed that they were the descendants of these gods. It's all throughout history in a lot in those cultures that they're interacting with humanity. They're fighting these wars. Now, we are told to put that in a box, that it's mythology. And this is great. I've got the rain absolutely about to pour down. So hopefully you guys can stay with me and I don't have to stop and relocate, keep my flow here going. But we've been asked to put this concept of mythology in a box. It's like, okay, well, hang on a minute. What if this mythology isn't complete pure invention, right? Which we've been told to steer away from. What if the stories are just distorted memories of different cultures with different names, different details, and they're historical, or their memories, right, of actual events happening in the ancient world? Because to me, that's what's fascinating, right? These ancient gods didn't simply disappear from history. Their influence is still woven into the culture all around us. And I've talked about this in a previous episode, right? We encounter the names and the legacies of these deities in everything around us, right? The names of the planets that we have, we got the days of the week, we got the names of the months, we got symbols, we got traditions. It's everywhere. We've adopted it. So you can't say it's not all around you, right? Again, I'm trying to point to things that you can see with your eyes and understand with your heart. Because now you're thinking critically. It's all around you in festivals, cultural practices that these nations are still observing now. And you have to ask yourself, why has the ancient world left such a deep fingerprint on the modern one? Right? Why would the stories of these gods, these demigods, these giants, these heavenly wars, supernatural interaction with humanity, why are they so persistent all across the ancient world? And what happens if I take those traditions and I place them beside Genesis 6, beside Jude, right? And beside some of the framework that you can read in Enoch? And so for me, you've got one starts to illuminate the other. Now, they're not providing every detail. We've still got holes in the plot. They don't answer every question that I've got. But they're giving me a framework now, a body of evidence, again, to look. And so that's what these books did for me. Because when I'm reading Enoch and Jasher and Jubilees and all these other ancient books, the Apocrypha, and you put it next to the scriptures, the disconnect starts to now connect. And it starts to open up, right? Which is what we've talked about. One rabbit hole leads to another. Because you've got Genesis 6 connecting to the flood connecting to the giants connecting to the later wars that we've still got. And now Jude, right, in the Bible, talking about angels leaving their estate for the earth. And now it's got a lot more context. And so these stories about these gods and extraordinary offspring now suddenly become, to me, worth investigating rather than automatically dismissing, which is what everybody tends to want to do, right? Because they're not told or taught to think critically. And so now if you look at it through a different lens, now you've got a little bit more context. And so some of these passages that were difficult for me started to open up. And you get the missing pieces to that puzzle. I can't prove everything that I've said. It's for you to put your effort into, because not everything always agrees with everything, but that body of evidence does seem to point towards at least something worth your attention instead of just sitting in the pew waiting for the final hymn. Right? So I keep investigating. I always do. Right? But as I get to this final point, today's a long episode. I love it. Hopefully, there's some people out there that want the extra time on this. But I wanted to do this topic justice without just skimming over it, saying, here's what I think. Because I want to be authentic here, and I want to get to the final exhibit, all right, the final investigation, which is the calendar. And this one's different from everything else I've already talked about today, because after all these years, I actually still don't have the answer. Now, I'm not saying I had the answer on the other ones, but I had what I considered to be a conclusion. But to me, this one's different because, let me explain. When I'm studying the biblical calendar, I'm not talking about some abstract theological question that has absolutely no effect on how I live, right? Again, a lot of people say, how does it relate to me? Well, this is how it relates to me. I'm talking about something that's actually incredibly practical, right? If scripture gives you appointed times, right? You've got Passover, Feast of Unleavened Bread, Shavuot, Feast of Trumpets, Day of Atonement, Sukkot, Feast of Tabernacles, right? Well, then when are they and why are they important? And how do we determine when they occur? How does the biblical year actually work? Now, again, today's episode is not about should we or shouldn't we still observe the appointed times. I'll save that for another episode. But the question that I'm asking today is far more basic, and hopefully you've stayed with me long enough to realize that there's going to be some relevance here. Because if the times were established according to a calendar, well, then what was the calendar? Because whether you believe we should still celebrate, observe, or not, the problem actually still remains that the days don't line up. The months don't line up, right? And to me, that was a real issue. I wanted something that would resolve the two of them, just like I've done with some of the other conclusions that I've come to. And so from the very beginning of Scripture, we've got this concept in Genesis where we've got this extraordinary pattern, right? 6 days and then a seventh. We've got a week. And for thousands of years, we're still living ourselves in that week of a 7-day cycle. So think about that, right? We've got these months that are not divided into weeks, right? Our years don't evenly divide into weeks. The number of days in our months is all over the place. We got 28, we got sometimes 29, we got 30, we got 31. But the 7-day cycle just keeps on going, right? 7 days, 7 days, 7 days. It's over and over and over again. Now, to me, that's fascinating because the 7-day rhythm that's found in Genesis is still the same rhythm that we're living to today. But therein lies the problem, because 52 sevens is 364 days. And so when I started to study the ancient biblical calendar traditions, I actually came across that number, right? You'll find 364, right? It's a year that's divided perfectly into 52 weeks. You got 4 seasons of 13 weeks, or 91 days in each season. And everything remaining on that 7-day cycle fits that. Found in Enoch, found in Jubilees, and other Dead Sea Scroll fragments, right? It's this constant 364-day calendar. Well, that's got my attention. And again, you say, well, how does it relate to me? It's like, well, there's a problem. Because there's no partial week left at the end of the year in Scripture, right? Or any of these other texts, right? You look at the flood account, right? You look at Genesis, and it's got this flood that begins on the 17th day of the second month. Scripture tells us that the waters prevailed for 150 days, and the ark rests on the 17th day of the 7th month, right? So you got second month to the 7th month, 150 days, 5 months, right? It appears to give you this 30-day cycle, right? And you'll see this 30-day cycle appears in other biblical periods throughout Scripture as well, right? So it's not just unique to Genesis. But now I've got a problem because now I've got 12 months of 30 days. That only gives me 360 days. So we've got 360 days there. We've got 364. But we live on a 365 day, 365.2465, I think it is. And then 366 in a leap year. And then you've actually got an additional adjustment that's built into long periods of time, in case you weren't aware of that, right? So which system is the biblical one? And how are the patterns meant to fit together, right? There's a conflict. So I went down this rabbit hole and I went deep. I was digging into the scripture. I read everything I could. And you're going to find that throughout scripture, there's perfection in the layout. You look at the instructions for the tabernacle, you got the measurements, the materials, the furniture, the priestly garments, the sacrificial order of things, the appointed times. It's detailed. It's ordered. Every single thing matters, down to measurements, materials, colors, right? And the way that even things were constructed, right? There's rules on all this stuff. And so I struggled when I came to the calendar, that the very system that determines Yahweh's calendar, the Sabbaths, the feasts, the seasons, it's like, close enough. It's like, it didn't make sense to me, right? Why we've got perfection in so many other areas of scripture, but this is like, close enough. Because if I'm going to observe Passover, if you choose to do that, when is it? If I'm going to observe Sukkot, when do I do it? Right? If these are the appointed times that scripture tells us to watch out for that have been completely swept aside, but how do we determine those appointments? And so then I started looking at the calendar that we're using today. And hopefully you're still with me here, because it's pretty obvious when you start to look at it, because even the names of the months preserve something that's changed in history. When you look at the September, right? Sept is 7, but it's our 9th month. October, right? 8, octopus, 8 is the 10th month. We've got November, 9, right? It's our 11th month. We've got December, which is 10, but it's our 12th month, right? Everything's off by a couple of months. So something's shifted, right? Nefariously or not, it's shifted, and we've named it that way. So it's in your face, right? You don't even realize what you're saying when you're saying it. And so, yes, moving the beginning of the year conceptually back those 2 months, might help everything line up, but it still doesn't solve the bigger problem, right? It doesn't solve the day count. And there are some cultures that have the spring as the start of the year. But the day count is still an issue, because I don't know how to get a 360-day version or a 364-day version with this uninterrupted 7-day cycle, the seasons, the moon, the observable solar year. They're all meant to work together. And I have tried and tried and tried. And it's the biggest investigation that I ever did, because it doesn't make sense. This is what I studied in Mexico, right? It was why I went to Egypt during the equinox to study this stuff, right? I wasn't just goofing around. I mean, I'm traveling the world looking for this stuff, because to me, it makes sense that it should fit. And after all of that, after all I had studied and revisiting, even talking about it today, I imagine you could probably hear the heart rate getting elevated here as I share it. I still don't have an answer that I'm completely satisfied with. But I can actually come across people that are absolutely convinced that they've sold it, right? And so they choose to follow a lunar calendar. They follow a lunar solar calendar. Some believe in a 364-day calendar. Some use the equinox. Some use the barley harvest, right? Some are using the sightings of new moons. And a lot of them are absolutely certain. And they all disagree with each other. And so for me, I look at it, I'm like, man, here we are again. And so I've got to be honest, I don't know. This one has stumped me personally for a long time. And it matters because we're living according to it. We're missing these appointed times and these dates and things that we should be looking for and getting distracted by all the other ones that they've put in front of us instead, right? Our modern holidays and festivities, so that we don't look for these appointed times and unlock the scripture. So, truly, if there's somebody out there that actually has done the work, now I'm not talking about people that have watched 3 videos and picked one of those things I just listed, right? But they've actually done the work, they haven't copied someone else's calendar, but they've actually genuinely studied the scriptures and the day count and the seasons fit, the appointed times, the sun, the moon, right? All these different systems. I want to hear from you, right? I'd love to hear from you and connect. Because I don't actually want to pretend that I've got the answer to this one. And that's why I intentionally put this investigation last in this episode. Because the other investigations that I spoke about brought me conclusions that I do feel strongly about. But this one doesn't. And so after everything I've studied, the charts, the notebooks, the conversations, even the traveling of the world, being in these places, the calendar still leaves me with those questions. And so maybe after a lifetime of searching, and particularly over the last 20 years, I've actually had to realize that I can live with that. Because somewhere along the journey that I've been on, I made a mistake. I thought the purpose of searching was to eventually reach that place where I had no more questions, where every contradiction that I studied was resolved, or every mystery had an explanation. Every piece of the puzzle was going to fit perfectly into place, which is what I wanted to do with this calendar. And that's just not where the journey's taken me, right? So some questions have led me to conclusions that I feel incredibly strong about, and others have opened doors to questions that I didn't even know existed, and I'm grateful. But here's what's changed, even though I don't have all the answers, and particularly on the calendar. I'm choosing to no longer allow what I don't know to silence everything else that I do know. And when I look back now, I think the strangest part of this journey for me is that the rabbit holes that I once thought were pulling me away from the scripture are actually pulling me back into it. Because for years, I searched outside of the Bible. I did the work, right? I questioned reality. I questioned history. I questioned institutions. I questioned whether scripture could actually be part of the deception itself. And I entertained possibilities that most believers would probably never even allow themselves to consider, and they'll shut off friendships over if somebody does. Now, I don't regret asking those questions, because when I eventually began putting the investigations back into the scriptures, I started seeing connections that I couldn't ignore. So I'm thrilled about it, right? Questions about the creation, the giants, the catastrophic flooding, the ancient writings, the mythology that's preserved, and even some of the stuff that I still don't have an answer for. Because the rabbit holes don't give me every answer. But they did force me to test what I believed, which has changed the way I live. I'm not caught up in the world's distractions and things that they put on TV, the news, the media, and things that they're telling us they're finding in outer space. I laugh. I won't get stuck down that rabbit hole. But I was able to finally understand what was actually happening all these years ago, because for a long time, what I was confusing was the failure of my marriage was the same failure in my search. And it undid me, because I didn't understand that they were never the same thing, right? My marriage failed, but my search didn't. The questions were still there. The scripture I'd memorized was still there, buried deep, but the years of study that I'd put in were still there. And the conclusions that I'd reached years ago, decades ago, were still there, as well as the unanswered questions that I've still got today. But now I'm starting to see them differently. I haven't, as I even share this episode, got this all figured out of how do I move forward? Because the unanswered questions have to be part of me now that can't erase everything else that I have learned. They can't undo it all, right? Changing my mind on something that I find now moving forward doesn't mean that the entire journey was a failure. And admitting that I don't know something or haven't come to a conclusion doesn't disqualify me from speaking on things that I have genuinely studied and believe now, and I feel like I can share. Because for years, I thought I needed to have every answer before I could help other people, before I could teach or at least share my observations. And particularly, what drove me here to this particular episode as well is I didn't want to wait before I could confidently teach my own daughters because I'd waited. But I can't do that anymore, right? They're getting too old, they're asking questions, and it forced my hand. This whole process, this torn bicep and surgery and career change and podcast and going solo, right? It all brought me to this very moment of even this episode where I'm sharing what I've found, even though I don't have all the answers. And for me, that's really hard because I have searched around the world for this one. And the others still intrigue me and I still spend time on them, but I'm always looking for more things that I'm not even going to share with you today that would make your head rock back so hard you'd get whiplash. But I'm going to teach what I do know. And I'm going to encourage my kids to continue asking questions, right? And investigate. And if tomorrow, next year, 10 years from now, right at the end of my life, if Yahweh shows me something that I misunderstood, then hopefully I have the humility to sit down and say, right, I was wrong. Let me unpack this, right? And then make the adjustment moving forward. That's all I can do. Because I don't want my daughters to grow up believing that strength means pretending to know everything. I want them to understand that conviction and humility can actually exist together. And you can believe something deeply and still test it. You can stand for something and still listen to someone else, right? You can change your mind without being ashamed that you once saw things differently. And you can actually get to the point where you say, I don't know, without actually abandoning everything that you do know. And that's where I'm today. I'm still searching. I'm still asking questions. Now I'm fired up about the calendar. I'm still wanting to go down these rabbit holes, right? But the difference is I'm no longer waiting until I reach the end of that rabbit hole. Because I've got to live according to the truth that I have already found. And I don't want to continue hiding the authentic version of myself that I've spent years becoming. I don't want to be afraid of searching for something or truth that might cost me. I've already lived that way. I've already gone quiet. I've already had a season of my life where I put the notebooks away and I left the Bible sitting in a box in the attic, getting eaten by rats. I don't want to do that again. So I will continue searching. I will continue speaking and sharing what I've found. And I'm going to continue and really start teaching my daughters that which I do know. And I'm going to continue to ask those difficult questions. And then when I'm wrong, which the search is all about, right? Finding something that's now true or truer than what you had, then hopefully I've got the humility at the time to admit it. Because maybe searching for the truth and trusting Yahweh in his perfect timing and revealing that to me were never enemies. I just thought they were. And so maybe all these questions and questions that you have aren't designed to actually pull you away like me, that I thought I was being pulled away. Maybe they're actually there to help pull you back. And that's what's helped drive me back in. I think when I look back, had I not had that period of my life before my first marriage failed, I might not have had anything to go back to. And so what I looked through as a really difficult and challenging time and walking away and looking into some other areas, being able to come back now, as I think through this, as I record this live, unedited, it shows me that Yahweh was there the whole time. And I'm pretty excited about that. Encourage those that are asking questions to realize that you can come back. And maybe sometimes the dark ages are Him leading you through and carrying you. So after decades of searching, you come back to that question, right? Is the Bible a fraud? And only you can answer that question for yourself, because I've come to that conclusion for myself, but I don't want you to accept my conclusion. I want you to dive in on it. And so I hope that this leaves you willing to investigate what you think are difficult questions and follow the evidence where you believe it's going, and at times be willing to say, I don't know, right? And not have the answers. Or was I wrong? But don't let the questions that you haven't had answered stop you from living according to the truth that you have already found. So I appreciate you guys staying with me for this long episode. I want you to keep searching, stay humble during that search, and keep looking for the strength to overcome. I'll catch you guys next week. Cheers.